My name is Emma and I'm 21 years old. I live in a small quiet apartment on the outskirts of the city, just close enough to the university to make my daily commute easy, but far enough to enjoy some peace and solitude. I don't have much, just a few pieces of old furniture, a small desk piled with books, and a bed I have to clean off every night after returning from class. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one, and don't forget to watch this video till the end because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. I moved here 2 years ago, full of hope and ambition. I left behind my small hometown where everyone knew everyone's business and each day felt like the last. I needed something different. College was my escape. It was supposed to be the place where I would finally figure out who I was, what I wanted from life, and where I could build the foundation for my future. I was determined to make something of myself, even if that meant starting from scratch. At first, it was overwhelming. The city felt like a foreign place. I didn't know anyone and I was out of my comfort zone. The classes were hard and I wasn't the brightest student. I wanted to make a good impression, but I couldn't help feeling like I didn't quite fit in. I didn't come from a wealthy background, and sometimes I wondered if that would always be a barrier between me and the people I was supposed to impress. But then I met Professor Grant and everything changed. Professor Grant was 60 years old, old enough to be my father, maybe even older. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. He had that rare quality that made people listen, really listen. He was a professor of literature and his classes were different, while other professors seemed like they were just going through the motions. Professor Grant made every word feel important. His lectures weren't just about literature, they were about life, human nature, the complexities of the world we live in. Every class was like a story. I could never quite understand how he did it. His voice was deep, smooth, and filled with emotion. Every lecture felt like a journey. There was something magnetic about him, something unspoken that drew me in. The more I watched him, the more I became fascinated with him, not just his intellect, but the way he carried himself, his wisdom, the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke of the great works of literature. I admired him, and at first it was just that admiration. He was in every sense of the word a giant in his field. I started staying after class, wanting to ask him questions, wanting to prove that I was dedicated, that I was serious about my studies. But something changed after a few weeks. It wasn't just academic admiration anymore. I started to feel something else, something more personal, more intimate. I wasn't sure how to process it, but I couldn't ignore it. Professor Grant had become more than just my teacher. One day I stayed late to ask him about an assignment, and that's when I realized how much I had changed. I had been struggling in my other courses, barely keeping up, but with his class I was determined to do well. I wanted him to see that I was serious, that I wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had this effect on me. He made me want to be better. Emma, you're a bright student, he told me one day, his voice warm, his smile sincere. You've got more potential than you give yourself credit for. His words were like a balm to my self-doubt. They made me feel like I could do anything, like maybe I wasn't just another forgettable face in the lecture hall. Maybe I had something to offer. But then, when midterms rolled around, I realized that I had procrastinated. I had left everything until the last minute. I hadn't done the necessary reading. I hadn't put in the effort. My paper wasn't My best work, far from it, but still I couldn't help but hope that maybe Professor Grant would see something in me, something beyond my mistakes, something worth rewarding. I had this crazy hope that maybe, just maybe, he would give me a break. When the grades came back, I was shocked. A perfect grade for a paper that didn't deserve it. I knew I hadn't earned it, but I also knew that somehow, in some way, I had it. Was like he had seen past my mistakes and saw me for what I could be rather than just what I had been. I couldn't contain the emotions that washed over me. Gratitude, confusion, and something else that I couldn't name. I felt like I owed him something, like he had done me a favor, and I couldn't leave it at that. I needed to thank him. The next day I went to his office after class. I knocked softly, unsure of what to expect. When he looked up from his papers, I felt a flutter in my chest. "Thank you, Professor," I said, my voice shaky. "Thank you for the grade. I didn't deserve it, but I really appreciate it." He smiled, the same warm smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the room. "You deserved it, Emma," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I see something in you. You just need to believe in yourself." Those words, simple as they were, stuck with me. For the first time in a long time, I believed in myself too. It wasn't just the grade, it was the fact that someone like him saw something in me, something that made me feel like I could be more than I had ever thought possible. That's when the idea began to form in my mind. Maybe there was more to this than just grades. Maybe I could get something more from him. He had been kind to me, praised me, and I couldn't ignore the growing feelings I had for him. I didn't want to admit it, but I was becoming obsessed. A few weeks later, I stayed after class again, but this time it wasn't about assignments or grades. It was about something more, something that made my heart race. I was struggling financially, and I didn't know how I was going to make it through the semester. I needed help. "I need your help, Professor," I said, my voice trembling, though I tried to sound confident. "I'm not doing well in some of my other courses. I really need to improve my grades if I want to stay in school." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. "What exactly are you asking, Emma?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undertone of something I couldn't identify. My heart pounded in my chest. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll do anything you want. Just make sure I pass." There was a long silence. I could feel the tension between us, and I regretted my words the moment they left my mouth. What was I asking for? Was I really prepared to go this far? Finally, he stepped toward me, his eyes sharp but softening just slightly. "You understand the consequences of this, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I fully understood. I didn't care. I needed this. I needed him. That night we crossed a line. It wasn't love, not at first. It was transactional. I gave him what he wanted, and he gave me what I needed. At first, it felt like a relief, a way to secure my future, a way to guarantee that I wouldn't have to worry about my grades anymore. But afterward, there was a rush of satisfaction, followed by a deep wave of guilt. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be simple, just a way to secure my future. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. The more I saw him, the more I wanted him. The physical connection was undeniable, but there was something else, something deeper I couldn't explain. It wasn't just about grades anymore. It was about him. It was about us. I tried to keep telling myself that I was using him, that this was just a means to an end, but I couldn't lie to myself. I was falling for him, and I couldn't stop it. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was dangerous, but I Couldn't help myself every time I was with him. It felt like I was being pulled deeper into his world. After that first night, everything changed. The dynamic between us shifted. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just about getting ahead, just about securing my future. I told myself I wasn't in love with him. How could I be? He was my professor. He was old enough to be my father. It didn't make sense, but the more I saw him, the more I began to realize that my feelings weren't just about grades or validation. They were about him, about the way he made me feel, the way he saw me. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those gray eyes that seemed to pierce through me, seeing parts of me I kept hidden from the world. There were moments when I was with him, when he looked at me with a certain softness, and I thought maybe he felt the same way. Maybe he was falling from me too, but deep down I knew the truth. This was wrong. It was dangerous. It could destroy us both, but still I couldn't pull away. The connection was too strong. We began to meet in secret, often late at night when the university was quiet and the halls empty. Our meetings were a mix of lectures, personal discussions, and fleeting touches. Each time it felt like I was falling deeper into something I couldn't control. Professor Grant would speak to me about his past, his regrets, and his ambitions. I listened, captivated by his wisdom and vulnerability. It felt intimate in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the emotional bond growing between us, a bond I couldn't break no matter how much I tried. The affair, which started as a way to secure my future, had become much more complicated. Professor Grant was no longer just my professor. He was someone I had come to rely on, someone I had fallen for, and I knew deep down that I wasn't the only one. There were moments when he would look at me with tenderness, and I let myself believe he cared for me too, but the guilt began to grow. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that we were breaking so many rules. The secrecy was suffocating, but it was the only way the affair could continue. I had promised myself it would stay simple, that it would just be about grades, just about securing my future. But every time I saw Professor Grant, it felt like the lines between us were becoming more blurred. I wasn't just doing this for my grades anymore. I was doing it for him. I wanted him. I couldn't deny it. No matter how hard I tried, I had fallen for him, and I knew it was dangerous, but it was too late to stop. Then one day, a few weeks later, I got an unexpected invitation. Professor Grant asked me to meet him in his office after hours. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for him to ask students to meet one-on-one, but as the time approached, I felt uneasy. When I arrived at his office, the door was slightly open. I knocked softly and entered. Professor Grant was sitting at his desk, papers scattered across the surface. He didn't look up at first, and I hesitated, unsure of what to say, but when he looked up and our eyes met, I felt a rush of emotions. Emma, he said softly, gesturing to the chair across from him. Sit down, I did, trying to steady my breath. Something about the way he spoke made my heart race. It wasn't the usual warmth I had come to expect from him. There was something different, something tense. I wanted to talk about where we're heading, he said, his voice steady but serious. What we're doing, Emma, I can't continue. My heart sank. His words hit me like a punch. It felt like the ground had been ripped from under me. I've been thinking a lot about this, he continued, his eyes focused on me. This affair, it's not fair to either of us. It can't go on. The weight of his words crushed me. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I didn't care about fairness, that I just Cared about him, but deep down I knew it was wrong. I don't want it to end. I whispered, I've fallen in love with you. He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. Emma, he said, his voice firm but tinged with sadness, you're not in love with me, you're in love with the idea of me. I'm your professor. This was always a mistake. I wanted to scream, to tell him that I didn't care about any of that, but deep down I knew he was right. It wasn't love, it couldn't be, it was wrong from the start. This has to end, he said. I'm sorry, but it's over. I stood frozen as he walked away, leaving me behind. It was the end of the affair, the end of everything. The days that followed were a blur. I kept going to class, trying to act normal, but everything felt wrong. The warmth in his eyes was gone. Every time I saw him, my heart broke. One day after class, he stopped me in the hallway. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice thick with emotion, but I'm not who you think I am. I can't be what you need. Goodbye, Emma, he said, and turned to leave. I stood there watching him disappear. I knew that was the end. The affair, the love, the fantasy, it was all over.